they accept the short term, if you will, setback that those areas have to be under Russian control while you play the longer term game of we're going to rebuild the remaining areas of Ukraine and we're going to do so by being part now, a guaranteed part of security and economic structures, such as NATO, such as the European Union.
And do you think Putin would go for that?
I think it's going to present him with a really interesting choice because, he could turn to the Russian people, he can declare his own victory, uh, but he can't declare a complete victory because remember, Putin tried to annex, in addition to Crimea, the entirety of 4 regions.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for TimesRadio. I'm James Hansen and today we're talking about the latest on the war in Ukraine, and I'm delighted to be joined by one of our regular guests here on Frontline, Professor Scott Lucas from the Clinton Institute at University College Dublin. Scott, always a pleasure. Welcome back.
Thank you for letting me back, sir.
As ever, so much to talk about. Let's begin by talking about these reports that there are now North Korean troops fighting for Russia in Ukraine. What is your reaction?
My reaction is that the Russians are gambling, that they can get away with this. It will be interesting to see what the international community's response is, whether they will reinforce Ukraine in light of this, because Russia has effectively expanded the war. But it also raises the question of why the Russians would take that risk. And I think, the Occam's razor answer is because the Russians need the personnel. Uh, we need to work through the claims into where exactly we are with this. This started with the Ukrainian military intelligence saying that thousands of North Koreans uh, were on their way to fight with the Russians, whether it be to help defend the Kursk region, which is where Ukraine has launched a cross border attack, taking part of the territory since August, or in Ukraine itself. Specifically, what Ukraine had said is, we killed a few of these folks. There was a North Korean military delegation that was in the Donetsk region in the occupied east of the country. They were watching or being instructed by the Russians about the training protocols that are used for troops there. The Ukrainians hit a gathering of personnel there, and amongst more than 20 people that were killed were 6 North Korean personnel. Now, that report was interesting because why would the North Koreans be in eastern Ukraine learning about training protocols? And of course, what we subsequently got was from Ukraine and then, importantly, from South Korea, were the reports from intelligence services that, yes, the North Korean troops were on their way. The South Koreans have publicly acknowledged, officially acknowledged, at least 1,500 personnel. However, South Korean media, from informed sources, so government sources, are saying about 12,000 personnel. That matches up with what the Ukrainian military intelligence head Kirill Budanov is saying. He's saying 11,000. So let's say that our best guess here is we're looking at 11 to 12,000 troops, which is a small number compared to what the Russian losses have been, especially on that eastern front. But it would be a significant injection of forces at a time when the Russians are trying to seize more territory in the east. And yes, it's coming from North Korea, who have not had previous deployments in this area of the world, who are coming from thousands of miles away. So you have to ask what's in it for North Korea. But again, you have to especially say, look, does this point to Russian strength? A coalition of the willing, to borrow that unfortunate term, or does it point to an actual Russian weakness that they're trying to cover up with the North Koreans, just as they have been taking North Korean munitions, reportedly hundreds of thousands, maybe millions of shells, and also North Korean missiles?
Well, you would have thought this is representative of the underlying weakness of Russia's position because, the casualty rate has been astonishingly high for Russia for really ever since the full-scale invasion now. We know that Putin is reluctant to launch a new wave of mobilization because of the political risk factors that poses for him. And look, the North Korean troops are unlikely to be the world's most advanced fighting force, but to Putin, presumably that doesn't matter. They're just more men he can feed into the meat grinder.
I think you're in a situation where the Russians are caught uh, between this heavy loss that they've taken. And, the reliable reports are they're taking around 1,200, 1,300, 1,400 casualties per day. Uh, Last week, they suffered, I think, the second deadliest day of the conflict this year. Uh, so they're taking what has now been a total of hundreds of thousands of casualties, but they don't want the full scale mobilization. Uh, that would give the lie to special military operation because all the Russians know this, that they're in a war which has now gone on for 32 months, that it is taking a high toll on the men who are being called up. But Putin still says, no, it's still containable. Now, that said, you have to acknowledge the Ukrainians have taken heavy losses as well, and the Ukraine does not have as many people to put on the front line, to counter Russians and now North Koreans. So you've got a window here. The Russians have advanced in the east. They have not advanced very quickly. To cut through all the hype in media, they have taken a couple of important towns in Donetsk. One of them was back in February, Avdiivka. More recently, they've taken Vuhledar, and they're on the point of taking two other towns, Toretsk and Pokrovsk. But even if they take those, it's still only part of the Donetsk region. And you're getting to the end of 2024. Battlefield conditions will be worse as we go from the autumn into the winter. How far can Russia advance to support where their political advantage lies? And their political advantage is to put up this impression Ukraine is cracking, Ukraine is breaking, they cannot hold out, they cannot hold out. In which case, their biggest potential ally is not Ukraine, because Ukraine's not going to capitulate. Their biggest ally is going to be the international community stepping away from this and saying it's just too heavy a loss for Ukraine to take. I think if the Russians don't make a decisive breakthrough militarily or politically by spring 25, we're talking about some type of resolution of this conflict in which Russia makes limited gains in the short term, but faces a significant defeat in the long term, because I think we're going to be facing what is a West Germany, East Germany situation.
Now that's really interesting. Let's expand on that. What do you mean
Okay.
by we could be facing a West Germany, East Germany situation?
So the West Germany, East Germany parallel is from the Cold War. And I'm sure your viewers will know that immediately after World War II, uh, with the division of Germany into effectively spheres of influence, that Russia had the sphere of influence in East Germany, including East Berlin, uh, that the United States, the UK, France had spheres of influence, which was the western part of Berlin and then West Germany. Now, what happened throughout the 1950s was a very concerted effort, not just by the US, UK, France, but by the much of the international community, which was we are going to show an advantage through strength. But this is going to be an economic strength, a political strength, even a cultural strength, as well as the security of West Germany. And that involved promoting the idea of West German economic recovery. And of course, by the end of the 1950s, West Germany was an economic power uh, which was on a parallel with another recovering power, Japan, and with much of Europe. West Germany was part of the new European Economic Community, later the European Union. West Germany, of course, was part of NATO. So you had this country which had a secure area backstopped by the UK, the rest of Europe, and even by countries outside of Europe. Meanwhile, East Germany, of course, was backstopped by the Soviet Union. But we know that eventually East Germany, as well as the rest of the communist bloc in Eastern Europe, could not run the course economically. They had military protection from the Soviets, but the economies could not deliver for the people. Now, let's go to 2024. Um, if Ukraine accepts the partition, and for reasons we can go into, I've got very good information now that they will. What you have is Ukraine, the Zelensky government saying, okay, put us into this parallel situation 75 years later, where Ukraine comes into NATO. That's the priority. So we don't have to face renewed Russian attacks. With us inside NATO, with allies throughout Europe, with the US, Canada as allies. In other words, as 33, one of 33 countries, then we can rebuild economically. And not only can we rebuild economically, we can actually, based on our experience of holding out against the Russians, have this economic position which is resurgent, manufacturing, an industrial position. Of course, the agricultural sector, Ukraine is already one of the world's leading countries. So over time, the 75% of Ukraine, which is still free, if you will, is in a much stronger position than the 25%, which is occupied by the Russians, because the Russians are going to have to finance the recovery in those areas. They're going to have to find resources from somewhere to rebuild the areas which they have devastated, or just let them go to hell and show weakness. And who would I rather be with in the long run in terms of an economic position if we go beyond the military conflict? I'd rather be with that share of the international community in Western Europe, the United States, countries in Asia, which continue to be economically developing, rather than with a Russia which will be economically constrained and isolated for many years to come.
I mean, there is so much to unpick there, Scott. First of all, when you talk about the partition of Ukraine, are you saying that you now think that President Zelensky will accept the areas that are currently illegally occupied by Russia? He will accept, if it comes with an agreement for NATO membership, EU membership, say, he will accept that those will be permanently ceded to Russia. Is that where you now think we are?
With the exception of the word permanently. Uh, Not only do I believe that, I've heard that from very well placed people. Let's just leave it at that. And that is, uh, there will be, once Ukraine gets the guarantee that they get this invitation to NATO. Now, membership of NATO will still be a process that will take some time. They have to pass other criteria. But once they get that, then they will show a willingness to go into talks, which will be brokered with the Russians. They will not, in advance of those talks, uh, give up those territories. But on the other hand, in advance of those talks, they will not demand the precondition of the withdrawal of Russian forces. Right. And at that point, what you're setting up is then, and it'll be interesting to see how the Kremlin reacts to this. But I think Ukraine will be signaling. And in fact, I think they've already signaled behind the scenes, yeah, that they will accept in the short term that just as they have not been able to get Crimea back since 2014, they're not going to be able to get what we call the Donbas, parts of the Donetsk and Luhansk regions in the east back, and they're not going to get parts of the south back, uh, part of the Kherson region, uh, you know, city like Mariupol, the one that fell after 12 weeks of just being pummeled by the Russians in 2022. Yeah, they accept the short term, if you will, setback that those areas have to be under Russian control while you play the longer term game of we're going to rebuild the remaining areas of Ukraine and we're going to do so by being part now, a guaranteed part of security and economic structures, such as NATO, such as the European Union.
And do you think Putin would go for that?
I think it's going to present him with a really interesting choice because, he could turn to the Russian people, he can declare his own victory, uh, but he can't declare a complete victory because remember, Putin tried to annex, in addition to Crimea, the entirety of four regions: Donetsk and Luhansk in the east, Zaporizhia and Kherson in the south. Ukraine took quite a bit of that southern territory back in 2022. So he's not going to get all of those regions that he, quote, annexed in September 2022. And he's not going to get back some of Donetsk if he accepts the talks. But on the other hand, if he refuses the talks, then, as we just discussed earlier, what's he going to do? He's going to go and continue to put more people into the war. He's going to risk the prospect that uh, Ukraine gets in 2025 those F-16 warplanes that they've been waiting for. That Ukraine may get the permission to carry out long-range missile strikes inside Russia. And remember one other thing: that if Putin refuses to go into those talks, he's got Ukrainian forces that hold part of Kursk in Western Russia. They've controlled still several hundred square kilometers in the first invasion of Russia or the Soviet Union since 1941. Is he going to give up that territory in perpetuity because he won't come to the table? Um, the, And also, by the way, if he refuses those talks, it undermines the Kremlin's narrative that they're the ones who've always been willing to negotiate.
And do you think President Zelensky would be able to sell such a deal internally in Ukraine? Because it's very easy for people in the international community to say, okay, it's just what needs to happen. You need to cede some of your sovereign territory in return for these security agreements. But, if you were in the UK and someone said, oh, just give over Kent and a bit of Essex, or if you were in the US and you said, oh, just give over Texas, Arizona, maybe a bit of California to the Mexicans, people understandably would be furious.
No, I don't think, this can't be the international community is like issuing a demand that Zelensky do this, and it won't be. And again, based on conversations with people, in the know, as it were, the, the Zelensky government thinks that they can get Ukrainian acceptance of this. And you might ask why. Look, the Ukrainians have been beyond valiant, um, beyond heroic. I don't use that term lightly, beyond heroic in resisting 32 months of an assault by the second largest military in the world. But they have lost a lot of personnel. Um, they, their military is depleted. The troops that are on the front line are tired. Many of them have not rotated in years. Um, they have wives, they have mothers, fathers, they have other relatives, friends who know this. They know how much they have sacrificed. They need time to recover. And I think, yeah, they will not be happy about it. But I think uh, the Ukrainians can hold their heads up high in terms of what they held on to. And again, I'll repeat this because, as always, it's important to cut through Russia propaganda. It's to cut through a lot of activists who should know better in the West. We thought Kyiv was going to fall within a few weeks in 2022. I'm talking about analysts, military analysts, political analysts. We thought Zelensky was going to have to leave Kyiv to save himself and that his government would fall. Russia had its puppet in place to go into Kyiv. He's now back in Russia, trying to avoid basically being arrested if he ever steps foot outside that country. To hold out for so long and to preserve much of Ukraine, that in its way is a significant victory, even if you have to give up part of the country. And I think that's what Zelensky was signaling last week. You might have taken those headlines about the victory plan. Now, there are several elements to the victory plan, economic, military, political, that Zelensky took uh, to Europe, took to the European Council, that he took to meetings with American and European leaders. Um, but you'll notice that the very first element he focused on the victory plan was this invitation to join NATO. So I think that was a signal which had been thought out by the Zelensky government, but I think it would have been thought out with respect to how Ukrainians would react, or indeed to what many Ukrainians now want. It um, West Germans would not have wanted to have the country divided in 1948, 1949. West Germans would not have wanted a situation where West Berlin, remember, was surrounded by East Germany and would be for the next 40, more than 40 years. But they had to accept that. They had to accept that for the part of the country in which they lived, they would have security, they would have a chance for prosperity. Ukrainians may have to accept that and hope that it doesn't take 43 years, as it did in the West German case, before we have reunification.
It sounds almost, Scott, as if you're saying we're at the beginning of the end of this war. And if that is true, how do you see the time frame playing out from now? I mean, obviously we're a couple of weeks away from the US election. Is this something the Biden administration will seek to tidy up before whoever the next president is takes office?
The Biden administration won't make a jump. They won't make a jump publicly before November the 5th and the election, because, of course, you not only have to watch what happens with the presidential election, whether Donald Trump comes into office, in which case Europe may have to go it alone without the Americans to work with Ukraine. You also have to watch what happens with the two houses of Congress, with the Senate, with the House. If Trump wins the White House and the Trumpists are in the ascendancy in both houses, then the American position is very, very tenuous. Um, so I wouldn't characterize this as, to paraphrase Winston Churchill, I wouldn't paraphrase this as the beginning of the end. This is the end of the beginning. Uh, it might seem like a long time, 32 months. Indeed, if you take the fact that Russia seized Crimea and broke up or tried to break up Ukraine since 2014, more than a decade. But I think we're in a phase now where the Russians will not be able to declare victory over the entire country, but Ukraine at the same time is going to have to compromise in terms of its sovereignty, its territorial integrity. And so, as we're at the end of the beginning, we get to, I think, to a really, really important phase, starting with the EU, but with other countries, because it's not just Europe, which is, look, if you have the United States having to bend a knee to Donald Trump and his chaos, his incoherence, his admiration for Vladimir Putin, do you have the strength to proceed while Washington is on the sidelines? And that's going to be a question, in other words, for 31 of NATO's 32 members, right? Which is going to be to each one of them, can you proceed? I do a lot of work with Polish media, and I think I can tell you that Poland, a country that quite often isn't noticed in the UK, they'll be there. They'll be there to support Ukraine going into NATO. The Baltic states, they'll be there. Czech Republic, yeah. France, I think, is signaling it's. Then we have to see what happens with Macron in power, but France is signaling it will. What happens with the U.S. and with Germany? Will the Germans accept this? And that takes us into a phase which it'll be a question of whether it moves as quickly as we did after World War II. Again, history doesn't always exactly repeat itself, but what you had was, once you had come out of the Berlin blockade, where the Soviet Union tried to break West Germany and tried to break West Berlin and failed because the international community supported West Berlin in that airlift and what was to happen. It was about another year, in fact, almost exactly a year, sorry, less than a year. It was 10 months between the Berlin blockade and NATO being established. Can you give Ukraine this commitment within 10 months to put it on the path to membership of NATO, or do you make Ukraine wait longer than that? That's going to be the challenge, which begins for Europe, but will include other countries as well.
Scott, this has been absolutely fascinating. It always is when we have these
Mm.
conversations. Just finally, I wanted to get your thoughts on what's been happening in Moldova, which is significant. They've been having a referendum to amend their constitution to have a commitment to join the European Union in the future. This is not equivalent to the Brexit referendum. This isn't about EU membership itself. It's about an intention, but it looks like very narrowly they have voted in favour of that. Just unpick the significance of that for us.
Well, just as we've been talking about the importance for security and stability of Ukraine getting some type of guarantee of its future, uh, this referendum uh, was almost a make or break question as to whether Moldova would guarantee its own security. The specifics of the referendum, you've laid out quite well. It was, this in June 2022, Moldova and Ukraine were granted candidacy to pursue EU membership. They're trying to satisfy the criteria for that. It will take some time longer, but this was being put to the Moldovan people, as it should be. Uh, you will get headlines today about how this is supposedly a huge setback, even though the government, the pro-EU government of Maya Sandu, President Sandu, won, because it will be only between 50.5 to 51%. That's how close it was. Remember, Brexit was 52-48, so I'm used to these things, right? Um, and I think those headlines are completely misguided, because to get that vote of just over 50%, Moldova had to withstand a concerted Russian campaign, which went beyond interference, to try to break the Moldovan voting system. We're talking about an estimated 100 million euros that Russia pumped into that country, one of the poorest countries in Europe, to try to buy votes. We're talking about 300,000 Moldovans being targeted by the Russians. That's about 10% of the voting population, and it's more than 20% of those who actually voted in this referendum. We are talking about direct payments that went to Moldovans. We're talking about people bringing in just under 10,000 euros in cash, because that's just under the limit that you have to declare in suitcases. We're talking about a Moldovan politician in exile in Russia who has been sanctioned by the international community, topping up the pension payments of elderly Moldovans. That's how far this went, right? And we're talking, remember, about a country where part of Moldova is occupied by the Russians and has been since 1992. And those people, of course, could vote in this referendum. And you know which way they probably voted. And still, Moldova voted for the intention to join the EU. And President Sandu, who the Russians want out of office, who they've tried to destabilize, she will have to go to a runoff, but she'll go to a runoff having won between 42-43% of the vote. So she'll be in a fairly strong position to get another term in office.
Scott, really appreciate your time as ever. Thank you so much for your insights and your analysis. Thank you for joining us today on Frontline.
Thank you, James, and thanks to all your viewers.
Thank you for watching today's episode of Frontline. For early access to our videos, member-only Q&As and live streams, then sign up for a membership via the link in the description. And for the latest news and breaking stories, listen to Times Radio and follow us at thetimes.com.